Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for the first of an interesting new series that we'll have monthly that talks about the latest cyber events over the past month and some of the latest findings that we had here at IronNet. But before we get started, I wanted to do a quick reminder that there's the report that we're referred to is available in the tab below of the screen. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can find that in the link below. You can get information about the speakers, ourselves, as well as a number of resources below in the tabs. And so I encourage you to take a look at that. There's a lot of great content down there, as well as links to previous webinars with our other esteemed guests. So take a look at that. So with that, let's get started with this week's webinar. So what I wanted to do is to do some quick introductions. If you guys don't know me, my name is Oliver Way. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing, and I'll be moderating this call for the session. So what I want to do is hand it off to our two guests. The first, I'll hand it off to Anthony, if you want to introduce yourself, and then you can pass the baton to Peter.
Thank you, Oliver. My name is Anthony Grenga. I am the VP of Cyber Operations here at IronNet. I'm responsible for both our threat intelligence team and our threat hunters. Peter?
Thanks, Anthony. My name is Peter Rudzinski. I am a detection research engineer here at IronNet. I lead our passive collections on our research team here. And I've been at IronNet for 3 years. Prior to that, I attended RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology. Yeah.
Very cool. So since this is the first time that the three of us are getting together, I thought that I'd start by asking just a little bit of additional question on your background, just to give the audience some context. So let me start with you, Anthony. The first thing is, if I remember correctly, you have an offensive background, not offensive, but cyber offensive background prior to IronNet. And so what I wanted to kind of get a sense of is how does that, playing the other side on offense, how does that help, you and your organization improve on the defensive side?
Yes, of course. So as Oliver mentioned, I did spend about 4.5 years over at NSA in offensive cyber. I miss it greatly, but now I'm very happy to be continuing that mission here at IronNet. So the big tie with offense versus defense is on the offensive side, you're basically looking for that one gap in the defense. Where it's a little bit harder on the defensive side, you have to identify every single gap to make sure that the attacker doesn't really have an opportunity to go through that chink in the armor.
Very cool. And Peter, you've been here for about 3 years now, done a lot of really cool stuff. I just wanted to kind of get a sense of what are you researching for IronNet today? Like, what's some of the topic areas? What gets you excited in terms of the advancements in cyber, both on the offensive and defensive side?
Yeah. As you mentioned, I'm on the emerging threats and detection research team here, and we definitely, I think, get to do some of the coolest stuff at the company. But basically, because of that, our main charter is to provide data and research and basically input for our analytics in order to better inform them so that they perform. Another small element of our team's work and focus is on supporting SIOC. So I also, and we'll mention this throughout the discussion today, I also work heavily with Anthony and his team to make sure that we're providing analysis on certain threats and again, tying that back into our research so that customers are more aware of what's going on as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's really great that you guys do the respective teams that you have. It's I've been around the block a while with a lot of different companies. It's really rare for a company like ours to have such great talent in this area, and I think this is going to make for a really interesting conversation. Just one more topic before we get on to the top news of July, which is, let's talk a little bit about Iron Lens, right? Iron Lens is our monthly report that we talk about, the top findings that we see live in customers that we've actually helped them identify, remediate, and then potentially become more resilient as an organization. I want to start with you, Anthony. Just real quick, for your cyber operations team, or what we're going to refer to as SIOC from this point onwards. What's the contribution to that report, and how does that impact our customers? And if you can give us some color, that would be great.
Yeah, yes, of course. So when I mentioned earlier, we do have some threat intelligence analysts along with threat hunters. The threat intelligence analysts are looking at what's going on in the cybersecurity landscape as a whole, and they're rolling that into the report in conjunction with what our threat hunters are seeing both through Overwatch of Iron Dome and through just full managed services in some of our customer environments. They're correlating what the threat analysts are seeing from the overall landscape along with what we're actually seeing inside of our customer environments to this one report.
Very cool. So it's not theoretical, it's all things that we've actually found, right?
Yeah,
awesome.
Yes, of course.
That's awesome. So here, how does the threat research team contribute to this report as well?
We are happy to be able to play a role in the Iron Lens report. And mainly what we provide is, as you'll notice in there, threat intelligence rules. There were many thousands of threat intelligence rules generated and ran across customer data. Many of those come from our team. We help to evaluate new domains and new services and things that come up on the internet and try to provide feedback on the reputation and things like that of these new features and domains on the internet.
Awesome. So yeah, you can't have a good defense without some research and some really good people actually test them out, see it works. So that's really great. So before we get started on the top news of the week, let's spend a moment. Once again, I'm going to remind everyone that all the resources that we talk about, Iron Lens, our previous webinars, bios. If you want to send a question, I know this is an on-demand webinar. We'll have an email, alias below that you can send information to. So please check that out. We'll start our conversation in a second. But if you have any questions, comments, we'd love to hear from you. So take a look, send something to us. So, all right, this is going to sit around on the internet for a while. So today is August, or at least the first few days of August. And so what we're going to focus on is the previous top news and the top things that we saw in the month of July 2020. So I think the biggest thing, right, for last month is the Twitter hack, right? Like it's got a lot of publicity. It's got a lot of interesting information. Some of it's also misinformation, right? Like things go very quickly, through the news cycle. There's a lot of conjecture. But let's start with you, Anthony. Like what have you heard, and what have you read and have you researched that's more definitive that can give us some audience, that they might have heard of the Twitter hack, but give some context on what actually happened.
Of course. So let's set the stage a little bit with some background. So on July 15th, about 130 high-profile Twitter accounts, these are verified accounts, recognizable with the blue check mark in the corner, posted a Bitcoin for Bitcoin tweet. The idea there is that if you would send Bitcoin to a wallet, that person, that celebrity or persona would then send you back twice the amount that you sent them, as part of a giving back to the community for the times that we've been going through. This is very reminiscent of the Nigerian prince email scam that we saw 10, 15 years ago, and is actually still relatively relevant today. In 2019, I think CNBC did say that Nigerian prince email scam still accounts for $700,000 in lost profit every year, which is kind of ridiculous to think of. This scam actually only managed to pull about $180,000 in Bitcoin. So they did a little bit less than the Nigerian prince scam. But overall, it was kind of a cobbled together mess of what happens when low-level hackers, or script kiddies, as we sometimes refer to them in the community, communicate together on Discord, maybe have never met each other, and they just start working through how they're going to make a lot of money. And what happens is an unorganized execution of this type of attack, where if you read some of the reports by Wired and Twitter themselves, where they're deep diving this incident, you could see that this wasn't necessarily the outcome that some of the parties involved wanted, and they wanted to actually monetize the access in a little bit better manner. So overall, what ended up happening is, of those 130 accounts, 40 accounts had their passwords reset, and 8 actually had their private data harvested, utilizing a unique Twitter admin panel that was prior, not really known in the community or at large, that allowed account takeover and access controls in various manners. From the cybersecurity perspective, Twitter has recently published a pretty in-depth aftermath of what happened, and there's just a recent post that has some real-world names of some of the hackers that are in custody now, and their ages, one of them being 17 years old, which you've seen a lot of hype in the news about someone this young doing something like this. As you mentioned, some of the misinformation that we saw initially when this hack came out, there was speculation from nation state to manipulation of what have you and everything in between. And this is just one of those things where it was relatively low impact compared to other cybersecurity incidents. I mean, $180,000 in Bitcoin doesn't even scratch the surface of some of the ransomware that we've seen this year. But it's a high profile thing like Twitter, and these are high profile names. So it gets a lot of spotlight, and with spotlight comes misinformation just in general. So Peter, I know that there's a lot of technical behind this, specifically what that admin panel means and why it even exists and how it was exposed to the internet. Can you add some commentary to what I just said?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of weeks ago when this all went down, we were we were chatting about this, and one of the things that we both remarked about was a tool like this, as capable as resetting passwords and pushing tweets and downloading full account data and things like that. An admin panel like that needs to be protected. It needs to be behind network, controls. You can't just have that exposed to the internet so that your employees can access that remotely. And we, obviously made that claim, but then we see that this is involved in this hack, and so we assume that the attackers have internal network access. And both of those things don't really go together. $180,000 worth of Bitcoin as the main scam here, and this level of Twitter network access, intimate Twitter network access, is just very bizarre. And so, I mean, that really caught us. And this new Wired article that came out a couple days ago that highlights exactly who was involved and how they were caught definitely adds a lot of color, given the fact that, those two things didn't really make sense. And that makes a little bit more sense now that we see that they were 17-year-olds, disorganized, didn't have really a great plan going forward, and more were interested in, it seemed, the account titles themselves more than they were interested in their access to Twitter. Now, that all being said, I think it is a very troubling story to see that companies as consequential as somebody like Twitter, as you were mentioning, Anthony, nation state, I'm sure there's plenty of nation states who'd be very happy to have access to Twitter's internal networks and be able to post tweets like that and cause disarray at a very opportune moment. And so we're very lucky that it was 17-year-olds, but it's still troubling to see that just a couple of kids were able to socially engineer probably some of the best trained employees of Twitter, people who have access to that admin panel. I'm sure had gone through many security trainings, and yet somehow were still fell victim to standard phishing and social engineering. So this definitely highlights an issue in the sort of personal side of security that every company deals with. So troubling.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor this too much, but I really like that point you made on the personal aspect. And one of the things that we've talked about internally is what unique access and some of these tools actually grant you, and how the world is evolving so quickly. And now we have multiple cloud platforms that only a few people may understand the intricacies of how they work. And this kind of ties directly in with some of the things we saw with Paige Thompson at the AWS Capital One breach, where it's just some unique knowledge and understanding that allowed them to manipulate that and then take that data in conjunction with just social engineering and spear phishing. You saw that take down and gain access to Hillary Clinton's emails a couple of years back, and just security awareness training overall, as you mentioned at Twitter. Even though you might have the best program out there, your employees still might fall victim to that, and that's where it really comes down to on the IronNet side, how we look to protect our companies from something like this. It's got to be post-Hugh interaction, and we got to try to identify that access, like maybe that unique IP address hitting that admin panel that's never done it before, through behavioral analytics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'd still find it interesting how you guys call it the Nigerian prince scam. I'll date myself a little bit, but I remember getting one like in the early 2000s. I thought this would kind of go away, but I guess they're just, these are old techniques, but good techniques, and they're just new variations of them. And so that's really interesting. Yeah. Before we go on to the next question, I just want to, kind of double click on the things that you guys mentioned, and just provide extra conversation around that. I do think that, what you guys mentioned makes a lot of sense, right? Like an organization like Twitter hires the best people, they have the best tools, they have the best capabilities. And it just goes to show that, having that is important, but as is, different dimensions of defense, right? Like, not just endpoints, not just firewalls, not just people training, but just how that all kind of comes together. And for organizations that may not have the people or the capabilities, right, like the ability to work together, work with great folks like yourself and Anthony and your SIAC team, that's something that is very important, and hopefully that's what we provide to all of our customers. Now, speaking of our customers, so let's switch gears a little bit. Twitter has been a really interesting, big news type of activity. It sounds like in reading last month's report that we saw an interesting amount of activities too with regards to the Valak campaign. I'm not as familiar with that, but I think I'll start with you, Anthony. Kind of give us same thing as Twitter. Give us some background, what you saw, what you detected, and what it means, and then going on to you, Peter, just to give us the color commentary on behind the scene what's going on.
Yeah, sounds good. So, excuse me. Just recently, actually, Palo Alto Unit 402 wrote up another summary of Valak. It's relatively interesting. But we'll just jump right into what IronNet has started observing. So as of last week, our own corporate email had seen at least one instance of a Valak encoded zip hit one of our employees, actually from a compromised contractor or consulting company. So it's kind of interesting to see that they're not only utilizing made up email accounts or maybe spoofed email accounts, they're actually using email access that they have gained through their campaign. On top of that, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, we observed Valak IOCs and behaviors across multiple customers and across the DOM as a whole, which is a little bit concerning. And as if you read the actual write-up on where Valak is going, they are starting to actually obfuscate some of their behaviors. So these, luckily enough, were known IOCs, so they were being blocked at a perimeter control device, but they were still existing on the endpoint. So this, as a network traffic analysis company, we only were observing the network behaviors, and we didn't get quite a chance to see what was going on the endpoint. But we can confirm, based on what Palo Alto has seen, that the malware itself is starting to obfuscate how it runs on the host. So this is a little bit concerning to see that maybe that malware is doing a little bit something different, so that the endpoint antivirus is not blocking it, and it is still able to beacon. Luckily, they're not changing their C2 domains. So if now you have to think that what happens if they would have changed their C2 domains in conjunction with obfuscating how their actual malware ran, and now that you have that two components of modifying C2 and modifying how the piece of malware actually runs, it starts to get a little concerning that something as simple as this, and that's been rampant enough, can still bypass security controls. And that just goes to the typical thing that we try to push on our end, is that it's very easy for attackers to change those things, and you have to actually look for the behaviors. Beyond that, Peter, I know there's a lot to this of what's going on there, and actually how it's going from encrypted zip to endpoint. So if you want to add some color there.
Sure. Before I jump in, I really want to highlight that the attack that we received on our internal employee is incredibly potent, and seeing an email coming in from a person you've emailed before is even more compelling for virtually anybody, including security professionals. So everybody at IronNet is far more in tune with cybersecurity than your average company employee. And again, something as potent as this type of phishing is going to trick many sophisticated cybersecurity defenders too. So definitely a fun and lucky thing that we were able to catch before it was too big of an issue. But for Valak specifically, obviously this is nothing new. Valak is actually fairly old. It was first identified in 2019, a year ago, and it originally was a common loader, just a loader for a bunch of other types of malware. And I think the reason that we're seeing such an increased visibility is because of its new info stealing capabilities and just a general greater overhaul to the loader itself. What's interesting is that these new capabilities that I'm referencing are delivered through your standard modular approach, which makes this malware highly flexible and basically allows an attacker to dynamically change its how it operates on the host and what it can do as they please. Basically, this is spread through your standard malspam infected zip with a word macro. I mean, Anthony, we've talked about this a lot over this past couple of years. That is probably the most common delivery mechanism that we see. It is simple and yet effective. And for some reason, enabling macros is still something we see plenty of people do, even after training. So clearly, we've got to do something better on that side. But it's effective, and that is basically how this is delivered. And this is where it kind of deviates and things get interesting. Valak uses a couple what they call alternate data streams to store off their malware. This makes it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to detect on the host itself. There's also some clever usage of registry keys for persistence and storing the actual malware files themselves. Again, nothing crazy here, but definitely a step up from your typical loader. I think the last little point I'd like to make about Valak, and something I found very interesting as we were working through a sample that was provided to us from Anthony, from you. We were working with one of the hunters for a customer who had observed Valak across their network. We decided that we wanted to detonate this. This was way back in May, before a lot of this blew up. We decided we wanted to detonate this sample so that we were able to collect some PCAP and network-related IOCs and feed that back into our analytics. As we were doing that, we noticed some very strange traffic coming, where it was very clear what was C2 traffic because it stood out like a sore thumb, especially in our detonation environment. But then we began to see what looked like C2 traffic. It highly resembled the C2 traffic, but it instead was being sent to legitimate domains. We were seeing the destination host was completely legitimate, and there was no messing with IP addresses or resolutions here. This was truly going to a legitimate destination. And again, this is not the first time we've seen this, but it turns out our guess was that this was decoy traffic, and that this was actually added to the binary or added to the malware so that it sort of helped the actual C2 traffic blend in a little bit. I have a hunch that it's possible they had analytics in mind. Something like an analytics platform like ours needs to be resilient to features that are seen across both legitimate traffic as well as malicious traffic. And so I think it's possible they added this not only to hide from analyst eyes, but also to hide from analytics, because if we see, the traffic that highly resembles C2 traffic going to legitimate destinations, it could possibly cause our analytics to have issues. But it was nice to see in this Palo Alto report that you mentioned, Anthony, that they corroborated our suspicion that this was indeed decoy traffic. And yeah, definitely a cool technique. Nothing, like I said, nothing crazy, nothing new. But as an analyst, you got to keep your eyes out and make sure you're looking, deeper and not just assuming that things are legitimate because you've seen them before or seen other things, communicating in the same way.
I think it's really interesting, right? Like what both of you guys have talked about, there's a number of things, that seems to hit home, right? One is the third-party risk, right? So the supply chain, whether it's digital or it's actual real supply chain, right? Like how they kind of get in. Number two is this is an oldie but a goodie, right? The kind of like your inference thing, if it works, it works, and it's how they've adapted it. That so that you may have had the IOCs from before, you might not be able to see it now, just with all the different tweaks. And I think that the last part you made, Peter, was extremely interesting, right? Like how they're starting to do the evasive methods to even evade analytic detection, like ours or in our space, the network detection response type of tools. I think it really highlights a couple of things that we do really well, right? With collective defense and Iron Dome, right? Like we've always believed that technology is important, but the human intelligence, that associate with it, work together in the community, it makes it so much better, right? So that maybe we've seen parts of it, our friends and other peer organizations have seen parts of it, right? And really the collective knowledge and collective working together allows us to have that many more eyes, and so that we can detect these things in real time and to mitigate them before something bad happens. So this sounds like it's a really great amalgam of all that capabilities. Okay, so talking about these old malware, in some sense, I can see why that they're getting sent out today, right? Like all of us are working from home. We're in a COVID environment, and so there's a lot of things that we've seen in July, right? Like in the United States, it's COVID is still kind of a big issue. Somewhere else, it might have tapered down a little bit, but it seems like COVID's still a global type of activity. So one thing that I want to start off, really first off on a very high level, just from the macro perspective, I think you guys have talked about them previously, some of what the nation states are doing in particular, that the global cyber powers that are trying to get information on vaccines so that they can help their population first. Let's start with you, Anthony. Let's talk about, the impact of IP theft, especially in the COVID times that we are today. Just, provide some insights, and some color that you've seen over the last month.
Yeah, of course. So, before we dive into one of the obvious recent events, which is Russia, obviously every nation state that has a SIGINT power or some backing on that front is looking to find as much information out about COVID as they can, because if and when the vaccine does get created, it likely will exist in its parent country first for quite some time before it gets spread around the globe. And so this just aligns directly with what Russia and China have previously done for the last 5 to 10 years, which is attempt to steal IP, because it is much cheaper to use cyber means and steal IP than it is to do that research and development on your own. So just a couple of weeks back, actually, UK National Cybersecurity Center, in conjunction with CSE, which is the Communications Security Establishment from Canada, put out a joint report detailing what Russian intelligence, specifically APT-29, Cozy Bear, have been doing across government targets, diplomatic, think tanks, healthcare, anyone that really has their hand or stake in potentially COVID information research, development, or numbers. And this isn't shocking to most people that have been in the cybersecurity realm, or at least been in the government for a little bit, because this is the type of stuff that everyone is interested in. So the report was detailing some behaviors that we kind of assumed were going on before they went out and outed them. Some of the bigger information in the report is actually about the 2 pieces of malware that Peter might have some better talking points on than myself. But basically, they were well-mess and well-mail, and they were specifically being attributed to APT-29 and some of the behaviors they were doing inside these environments that both NCSC and CSE have doxed them in. So Peter, if you want to take a little bit of detail on well-mess and well-mail.
Yeah, these are not new pieces of malware, and the reason that they were, included is mainly because of, what was being seen, not because of the real novelty of the pieces of malware themselves. But they're basically your standard Go and .NET lightweight rats and basic C2 and loader capabilities there. But I think what I found more interesting was the fact that, and honestly upsetting, was the fact that in the report it mentioned the vulnerabilities, one of the main vulnerabilities that they identified being targeted, and I think it is actually a group of 3 vulnerabilities, but they were these VPN vulnerabilities from last year and from prior years, actually from 2018, even dating back to 2018. And it is definitely upsetting that as a company that's attempting to focus your efforts on researching a cure for a global pandemic, that you also need to be aware of highly sophisticated nation state actors at play. That is upsetting, but I do think that it's sad that we have companies that are working on something as sensitive as that are not addressing their external accesses. And I think that, having vulnerabilities and having outdated software is common across most, and I would say most enterprises in the United States. It's just upsetting to see that things like a VPN vulnerability, something as impactful and something that we saw even last year, cause as much damage and widespread access as we did, to see that come back up again, and especially with something like a COVID, research institution, that's definitely troubling. So unfortunate to see that referenced again.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, right? Like it seems like, in today's world, especially, you might not have patched the VPNs just because you never thought that you'd be in this position when 90%, maybe more of your whole staff is working from home, and that makes it really difficult because, like, you can plan, you can test, you can try to anticipate where threats might be coming, but then there's always life always throws you a curveball, and then you just gotta deal with it. And I think one of the things that IronNet does fairly well, right? Like there's just so much things out there that you have to look for and try to figure out. But what we do provide is the ability to kind of see what's around the corner, right? At least, within your neighborhood, the peers that you work with, the supply chains that you might work with, having that common, real-time sharing does give you at least some early warning, right? Like as opposed to being after the fact in many cases. So Peter, let's start with you on this stuff. So we've talked about Russia on the macro level, right? Like about intellectual theft. What are some of the things that you're tracking, from a COVID perspective, just in general, right? Like just like people working from home, what do you think about them? What are you seeing more of? What are you hearing? And then, after that, we'll switch gears and we'll talk to Anthony about what he's actually doing to protect our customers from that. So let's start with you, Peter.
Sure. I think in the beginning, everyone was talking about, everyone in the security field was talking about the increase in what they would expect given work from home and COVID. And everyone was focused on phishing, and new domains stood up for like COVID maps and trackers and this, that, and the other thing. And I think that definitely there was a lot of buzz about that in the beginning, but that sort of petered out after a while. And we actually see a different trend where we didn't see many compromises, and we didn't see a lot of campaigns that really pushed along those same original lines for that much longer. Things sort of shifted towards sort of e-commerce and your typical human web browsing. What do people do on their free time? And so from our perspective, we have seen the same amount, if not more, of your phishing kits being deployed, and again, nothing COVID themed. It was your standard deployment. It just maybe an increase in phishing in general because they know people are going to be working on laptops remote and not having in-person, face-to-face discussions and meetings. And so, these types of digital avenues are going to become more popular, and phishing obviously has been the choice there. So nothing crazy, and again, nothing specific to COVID itself. It was just your standard common service phishing. So, yeah.
Cool. Anthony, what have you seen in our customers' environments?
Yeah, and so Peter kind of is hitting one of the main points is standard phishing and what have you. One of the biggest things that we're kind of tying into this change in user behavior, because this change in work location, as a lot of people are moving to remote, is when you're not in an office and you don't potentially have someone that's going to walk by and ask you a question, or you don't have the standard sitting in an office chair and in that type of environment, you might just your brain might start to wander more towards a non-work style of using the computer, and you might forget that this computer is a corporate asset. And we've noticed that across all of our customers, across the dome, in terms of what we would call non-standard or not typical browsing, such as streaming media, e-commerce sites that are less than reputable, sports betting, you name it, people are doing it on the internet, and we're seeing it in higher numbers than we saw prior. And this might just be because when they're working from home, it might be more acceptable to them, even though they're still going through a VPN and they're still having they're still putting their network and their computer at risk. Because of this change in user browsing behavior, in my opinion, we've seen an unprecedented amount of commodity malware beaconing in customer environments. Just last month in our report, we documented both Conficker and Emotet existing, which shouldn't exist for some of these highly protected corporate environments. And mostly, I think they're ending up on people's endpoints from random browsing or potentially lowering their guard behavior on corporate assets. So that, in conjunction with attackers living off the land, with this move towards e-commerce, you've seen a dramatic rise in the last couple of months in mage cart or credit card skimming style behaviors, in conjunction with e-commerce style phishing, which is masquerading as Amazon or eBay or PayPal for payments, or scam sites that are offering designer or expensive goods at discounted prices for anyone that is willing to use them. Overall, the biggest thing here is this change in how we are working is changing how attackers adapted just as fast. And on the defensive side, we're starting to see a shift, and corporations are starting to put policies in place. They're starting to crack down on some of this thing, and we're seeing it move back towards the norm, even though it is remote. But overall, we're hopeful, and we're looking for the norm to rebalance.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on that and stress the importance of, if you do have a corporate VPN, the importance of leaving your host on that VPN. If you're going to go and do personal browsing on your company given assets, whether that's against your policies or not, I don't know, but that's fine as long as you're on the VPN and your corporation can evaluate and analyze what's going on your host. That at least gives them a fighting chance. Whereas if you're just sitting isolated on your network, accessing corporate information and sensitive corporate details, but not operating on the VPN, you're essentially invisible unless you're using any host-based, antivirus and things like that. So it's really critical that employees are, again, as Anthony said, adapting to this new norm of, hey, when I connect, I've got to get on the VPN, not because it's that much safer to really operate than my home network, but more just simply because it gives my company visibility into what's going on my endpoint.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like, even in many of our customers' cases, they may already have the best host-based systems that are out there, yet you still need that visibility because there are always things that kind of slip through, and that's unfortunate.
Just to tie back in from the original story we were talking about with Valak, you see a shift in their TTPs, and they've added some obfuscation that, as Anthony was speculating, could potentially have hindered some host-based detection systems. So again, stressing that importance of network behavioral analysis and making sure that your host is on a controlled network for evaluation.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, so we're on our last topic, right? So we talked a lot about, the COVID times, how things are changing. We talked a little bit about the macro perspective of what's going on. Let's close it out with, vulnerabilities, right? It's one of these things that when people think about cyber defenses, it's always 0 days and all that good stuff. So let's start with you, Anthony. I mean, you guys were tracking one of the newer I wouldn't say 0 days, but CVEs from July. So talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go on to Peter to provide some color as well.
Yeah, of course. So a little bit of background here, just to make this a fun conversation. The U.S. CERT actually published in May, I believe, the top 10 vulnerabilities they're seeing across all companies, and 7 of the 10 were 2 to 3 years old. So even though you're saying this isn't a 0 day, end-day vulnerabilities are so rampant, and this ties back into what Peter was just saying a couple minutes ago. So what we're going to talk about is SIGRED. So this was published on July 14th on Patch Tuesday. It was research conducted by Checkpoint. They responsibly disclosed in May. Microsoft actually deployed the patch, and the CVE came out right on Patch Tuesday. And what you're seeing is this is a DNS vulnerability that some researchers are calling as wormable because it impacts a server, a service, such that you could kind of manipulate it and cause a wormable piece of malware. From our perspective, the biggest thing we have to do for our customers is educate them on, even though they have their enterprise controls for patching, what the impact could be for this type of vulnerability and how we can monitor it up until they are able to patch this type of thing. And for the most part, we are able to understand, and the proof of concepts that have been published have been a little lacking in this avenue, actually. So we really haven't seen anything in the real world, but at least we know that this is the type of thing that could happen, and the types of traffic that they could use to abuse it. Beyond that, this is likely not going to be a thing until someone publishes a POC in the wild. And then you're going to see some rampant abuse of it, like we said, for all these companies that have poor patch timing or bad cycles to make sure that their infrastructure is patched. So Peter, what was a little technical aspects that you thought of? I know we talked briefly about how this is being kind of blown into a bigger thing than it would be, based on if you actually implemented DNS correctly in the first place. There's a lot more to it. So what do you thought?
Yeah, I think I'd start by saying or addressing the wormable claim. And I'm not saying that it isn't wormable, but I will say that I think we've gotten to a point where we're kind of overusing the word, maybe, where in my eyes, I don't see this as really what I would call a wormable vulnerability. And I think that because it was called wormable and because it received a CVE score of 10 out of 10, that it just blew up, and everyone was freaking out about it. And what's crazy to even think about is the fact that if you read through the report, they even claim that not only is this incredibly difficult to actually implement as a vulnerability, they haven't even finally followed through and been able to cause remote code execution. They've just been able to cause a buffer overflow that appears that you could then leverage it for remote code execution or something like that. But they haven't actually, again, as you mentioned, put out that POC proving that is possible. They've just shown, what looks like the circumstances are correct for. So kind of strange to see that happen. And then an extra little cherry on top is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the terminology for this being a wormable vulnerability came from Windows itself, from Microsoft. So I'm a little bit just thrown by all of what had happened here, given that, again, I think the main hype around this came from the fact that wormable was included in this reporting. So, but anyways, to get onto the specifics of the vulnerability itself, basically, this is a very, very old vulnerability in DNS. And I really appreciated the checkpoint report that they put out, because it included sort of their thought process and background on how they even stumbled on this vulnerability. And I thought it was cool to see that obviously they knew that security researchers had been largely addressing the query side of DNS. So can I send a malicious query, and will the server process that malicious query in a way that I can take advantage of? That's the standard logical chain of events that happens when you're evaluating DNS security. They said, let's not do it that way. Let's instead reverse that and say, how do these DNS replies get handled by a DNS server? And if you understand the DNS hierarchy and DNS architecture, DNS replies have just as much potential for being malicious as DNS queries do. I wouldn't say just as much, but still have potential for being malicious. And so they addressed it from that side, started poking at how does this DNS server, how does Windows DNS server process replies from other DNS servers, and they ended up stumbling on a very standard buffer overflow that is triggered by DNS name compression. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the basics of it, is that DNS name compression takes place. There is a maximum size for DNS replies. With the compression, the total size is calculated and does not account for the expansion of that data after it is being compressed. And once that is expanded, it causes a buffer overflow because the server receiving the reply has allocated an incorrect amount of memory for that particular request. And so as it receives it, it then causes that buffer overflow and causes the server to crash. Again, that's the very trimmed down basics of it. Checkpoint, I think, did a really good job coming out and discussing that, as well as Sophos did another sort of analysis of this and dumbed it down, I thought, to a nice level that kept enough of the technical in there so you can understand it, but also made it understandable for those that aren't highly familiar with DNS or something like that. The one cool piece I'd like to point out about this is that because of the nature of this particular vulnerability, all that is necessary to compromise a DNS server, which is likely also an Active Directory domain controller in most typical enterprise environments, because of the fact that all you need is to have a malicious reply come back to this DNS server. One of the avenues of attack is actually having a malicious website or a malicious email or something like that contain a DNS name that then will trigger your DNS server to send a malicious reply to the DNS server in the target environment. So as you can see, based on what I just said, there is no need for you to have any access or to touch the DNS, the Active Directory domain controller, the DNS server. All you need is a host on that network to query, and then a reply gets sent back through the DNS hierarchy. So that is a fairly potent aspect to this that makes it very difficult to pin down, and definitely a vulnerability you want to keep your eyes out for.
That's really great, and I think that's a really wonderful description of all the details that goes on in this vulnerability. Which reminds me to remind everybody that if you wanted to see some of these and more of Peter's research along with the teams, follow us on Twitter at IronNetTR, which you'll see all the latest news and all the latest things that they're tracking, including this particular vulnerability that they're looking at. So I think we're at the end of our webinar this week. You know, you guys provided some great information. But before we let everyone go and before we sign off, I wanted to remind everyone that the IronNet webinar Bright Talk channel has a lot of good content. We've got some great guests, ranging all the way from national figures, thought leaders, to technical folks like the two that you've listened to over the past 40 minutes or so. So check us out. Thank you for joining again. Don't forget, rate us, hopefully, and also, contact us below in the email alias if you have any questions, if you have any suggestions, if you have anything else you want us to cover, because we can go in a number of different directions in terms of you want to talk more about the news, you want to talk more about vulnerabilities or what we found, let us know. With that, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. This was a wonderful talk, and look forward to doing this in a couple weeks.
Of course.
Absolutely. Thanks, Oliver.
Bye, guys.